The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances as Claire Roberts, a seasoned flight attendant, stood rigidly before an older man seated near the window. Her sharp and authoritative voice cut through the airplane's quiet hum. "Sir, I need to see your ticket," she demanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. The man, James Carter, responded calmly, his steady hands handing over the slip of paper without hesitation. But Claire wasn't satisfied. Holding the ticket up to the light as if expecting to uncover a forgery, her expression betrayed a mix of doubt and condescension. "This doesn't seem right," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Moments later, a collective gasp echoed through the cabin as Claire's frustrations boiled over into an action that stunned everyone. The man she had questioned, however, didn't retaliate. Instead, his calm demeanor masked a truth that would shake the airline to its core and forever change Claire's life. Before we dive deeper into this captivating story of redemption, reflection, and transformation, comment below with the city or country you're watching from today. If you're enjoying this tale of life-changing lessons and resilience, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. James Carter, a man of unassuming charm and quiet resilience, stepped onto the airplane's first-class cabin with a weathered leather briefcase. At 60 years old, his neatly combed silver hair, soft blue eyes, and warm demeanor painted a picture of wisdom and humility. To the world, he was an untouchable billionaire, the owner of one of the most successful multinational companies in the country. James was simply a kind, thoughtful man to those who met him. Dressed in a light gray suit and modest loafers, James looked more like an amiable neighbor than the financial powerhouse he was. He never flaunted his wealth or achievements, preferring to blend in and enjoy simpler pleasures. However, blending in would be challenging today, as his flight home would be anything but ordinary. The first-class cabin glowed softly under the ambient lights, its luxurious leather seats and polished finishes inviting weary travelers to relax. James moved quietly through the aisle, offering polite nods to his fellow passengers. Though most didn't recognize him, he liked it that way. Anonymity was a luxury he cherished even more than the cushioned recliner he was about to occupy. Reaching his seat near the window, James carefully stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment. He settled into his seat, letting out a soft sigh of relief. It had been a long day of back-to-back meetings and high-stakes negotiations. His company had been finalizing a deal that would soon reshape the airline industry, but he sought solace above the clouds for now. A flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. She was younger, perhaps in her mid-20s, and her demeanor was polite but distant. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything to drink before we take off?" "Just water, please," James replied with a gentle smile. The flight attendant nodded and walked away to fulfill his request. James turned his gaze toward the window, watching as the airport ground staff bustled about below. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the tarmac. As James waited, his thoughts drifted to his past. Born into a struggling family, he had clawed his way up through sheer determination and unwavering belief in himself. He recalled the many sacrifices his parents had made to give him a chance at education. Those memories fueled his desire not just to succeed, but to give back. Through his philanthropic endeavors, James had funded schools, supported underprivileged communities, and advocated for systemic change in industries marred by inequality. He reached into his carry-on bag, pulling out a well-thumbed book. The cabin was beginning to fill with passengers, their quiet conversations mingling with the faint hum of the air conditioning. For James, reading provided a respite, a chance to momentarily escape the pressures of his high-stakes world. But his tranquility was short-lived. As James opened the first chapter, a new figure emerged in the aisle. Claire Roberts. Claire was a senior flight attendant in her late 30s. Her uniform was immaculate, her makeup flawless, and her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. While her appearance exuded professionalism, her eyes carried an unmistakable sharpness that hinted at impatience. Claire approached James's seat, her heels clicking against the carpeted aisle. She stopped abruptly, her gaze sweeping over him with barely concealed skepticism. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone cool and clipped. "I believe you've wandered into the wrong section. Economy class is further back." James blinked, momentarily startled by her brusque tone. He recovered quickly, offering her a polite smile. "I assure you I'm in the correct seat," he said calmly. Claire's eyebrows arched in disbelief. She glanced around the cabin, noting the curious gazes of other passengers. Some were already whispering amongst themselves. "May I see your ticket?" she demanded, holding out her hand with an air of authority. James felt a familiar pang in his chest. Though he rarely experienced overt hostility, he was no stranger to being underestimated based on appearances. Remaining composed, he reached into his pocket and handed Claire his ticket. She examined it with exaggerated care, tilting it toward the light as if searching for a forgery. The uncomfortable silence in the cabin grew heavier. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting between James and Claire. After what felt like an eternity, James spoke softly, breaking the tension. "Is there a problem?" Claire's lips thinned. "This ticket looks unusual," she muttered, her voice dripping with doubt. "I'll need to verify it with the gate agent." James nodded, unflustered. "Take all the time you need," he replied evenly. "I assure you it's legitimate." With a huff, Claire spun on her heel and marched toward the front of the cabin. James sighed and leaned back in his seat. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself with a deep breath. Though moments like these never became easier to endure, he had learned to approach them with grace, patience, and resilience. Anger, he knew, would solve nothing. When Claire returned, her face was flushed with embarrassment. She thrust the ticket back at James, her hand trembling slightly. "It seems your ticket is valid," she admitted through gritted teeth, though her expression remained stormy. James met her gaze steadily. "I appreciate your thoroughness," he said, his voice calm but firm. Claire's nostrils flared. Whispers rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others amused. James turned his attention back to his book, hoping to let the incident fade into obscurity. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. The quiet flight he had anticipated was about to become a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the entire airline. The hum of the airplane cabin returned to normal as Claire retreated to the service area. Though the atmosphere still felt tense, James remained calm, focusing on his book, though his thoughts lingered on the encounter. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. Some offered apologetic smiles, while others appeared intrigued by the situation. For James, this was not the first time he'd faced such a moment. His life had been peppered with subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that assumptions based on appearance often overshadowed facts. But this moment stung more than usual, perhaps because he had sought peace, not confrontation, on this flight. As the minutes passed, James tried to immerse himself in the pages of his book, hoping the flight would proceed without further incident. However, Claire had other plans. When she returned to the first-class cabin, her demeanor was noticeably colder. Though she avoided direct eye contact with James, she found ways to make her presence felt. As she served drinks to the other passengers, her movements were brisk and loud, trays clattering more than necessary. It was clear she was making a statement. When Claire passed James's seat, she paused briefly, her voice sharp. "Sir, please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. We wouldn't want any issues during takeoff." Her tone was pointed, and James detected a faint sneer. He met her gaze with unwavering composure. "Thank you for your concern," he replied, his voice steady. Several passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident. One man across the aisle frowned, leaning slightly toward James. "You doing okay over there?" he asked quietly. James offered a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you." The man nodded, though his expression remained concerned. Claire, meanwhile, busied herself at the front of the cabin, apart, her back turned to the passengers. As the plane began its ascent, James closed his book and gazed out the window. The city lights below shimmered like scattered jewels, slowly giving way to the inky expanse of the night sky. He felt a momentary sense of calm, but it was fleeting. During the meal service, the tension resurfaced. Claire approached James with a tray, her movements stiff and her expression unreadable. "Chicken or fish?" she asked curtly. "Chicken, please," James replied. Claire placed the tray in front of him with a little too much force, causing the utensils to rattle. James glanced up at her, his brow furrowing slightly, but he said nothing. He adjusted the tray, taking care to avoid any spills, and began to eat in silence. It was then that the unthinkable happened. Claire, still standing nearby, appeared to lose her composure entirely. "You know," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "some people think they can just buy their way into places they don't belong." The cabin fell silent. All eyes turned to Claire, whose face was a mixture of defiance and nervous energy. James set down his fork and looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. "Excuse me?" Claire crossed her arms. "I've worked in first class for over a decade," she continued, her voice growing louder. "I can tell when someone doesn't belong here." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The man across the aisle looked ready to intervene, but James raised a hand, signaling for him to stay seated. "I think you've made yourself very clear," James said evenly, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my meal." But Claire wasn't finished. Her frustration boiled over, and before anyone could stop her, she leaned forward and slapped James across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin, leaving passengers stunned. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. James's head snapped to the side from the force of the slap, his cheek stinging. Slowly, he turned back to face Claire, his expression calm but somber. The silence was broken by the click of a phone camera. Several passengers had begun recording the incident, their phones held discreetly but unmistakably. Claire's face turned pale as she realized the gravity of her actions. James raised a hand to his cheek, his calm demeanor masking the emotions simmering beneath the surface. He took a deep breath, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "Why did you do that?" "Bookmark, go back." Claire stammered, her confidence evaporating. You were being disruptive," she said weakly. "This is first class, and we have standards to uphold." James studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "I see," he said simply. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered urgently to one another, some visibly upset, others outraged on James's behalf. The man across the aisle stood up, his voice firm. "This is unacceptable," he said, addressing Claire. "You owe him an apology." Claire's eyes darted around the cabin, her face flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a soft chime interrupted her. James reached for his phone, which had vibrated in his pocket. A notification lit up the screen, and as he read it, a faint smile crossed his face. The message was brief but monumental. The deal he had been working on for months had just been finalized. His company now owned the airline. Without a word, James tucked the phone away and reached for his laptop. He began typing an email detailing the incident with precise, measured words. His calm exterior betrayed no hint of the fire burning within him. For the rest of the flight, Claire avoided James entirely, delegating her responsibilities to her colleagues. She moved through the cabin with nervous energy, her interactions with passengers noticeably strained. James, meanwhile, observed quietly, taking mental notes. He noticed how Claire's demeanor shifted, depending on who she was speaking to. She was polite and attentive to some passengers, dismissive and curt to others. It was a pattern that did not escape his notice. As the plane cruised through the night sky, James made a decision. This incident would not be swept under the rug. It was more than a personal affront. It was a symptom of a larger issue within the airline. What had begun as a simple flight home was now a call to action. James resolved to use his position to bring about meaningful change, not just for himself, but for every passenger who had ever felt the sting of prejudice. As the plane soared through the night sky, James Carter sat quietly in his first-class seat, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the sting of the slap, not just on his cheek but on his dignity. Yet instead of anger, James felt a deep resolve. This wasn't about retaliation, it was about accountability. He had spent his life overcoming obstacles, and now, this incident provided an unexpected opportunity to address systemic issues he suspected ran far deeper than one person's behavior. James shifted his focus back to his laptop. The email he drafted was concise yet thorough, detailing every moment of the encounter with Claire Roberts. He included observations of her interactions with other passengers, highlighting the clear inconsistencies in her behavior. Once the email was sent to the airline's CEO, a man James had worked with briefly during negotiations for the acquisition, James closed his laptop and leaned back in his seat. His resolve was firm. Change had to start at the top. Meanwhile, Claire avoided eye contact with James and most of the other passengers. Her confident demeanor had cracked, and whispers about the incident continued to ripple through the cabin. James noticed how her interactions with other passengers grew increasingly inconsistent. A middle-aged white man seated a few rows ahead of James asked for a second glass of wine. Claire responded with a bright, eager smile, practically rushing to fulfill his request. In stark contrast, when an elderly black woman struggled to lift her carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, Claire merely glanced at her and turned away, pretending not to notice. The elderly woman looked around for help, her voice trembling. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Could someone please assist me?" James rose from his seat, unable to ignore the situation. "Allow me, ma'am," he said gently, his voice filled with warmth. The woman's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you so much, young man," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. James lifted the bag with ease, securing it in the compartment. He nodded reassuringly at the woman before returning to his seat. As he did, he caught Claire watching him from the corner of her eye. Her expression was a complex mix of defiance and discomfort. And James couldn't help but wonder if she was beginning to question her actions. The remainder of the flight passed in a strained silence. James continued to observe the interactions around him, noting every instance where Claire's behavior seemed to reflect biases. Her body language, tone of voice, and level of attentiveness all shifted depending on the passenger. By the time the plane began its descent, James had already formed a clear picture of the broader issues at play. He wasn't simply dealing with one rude flight attendant. He was confronting a culture that allowed such behavior to persist. When the wheels touched down, James remained seated, allowing the other passengers to disembark first. He watched Claire as she busied herself at the front of the cabin, her movements stiff and mechanical. As James gathered his belongings, he took one last look around the cabin. This was no longer just a plane to him. It was a microcosm of the larger world, filled with inequality, prejudice, and the potential for transformation. Back at his office the next day, James met with his leadership team. The airline's acquisition had just been finalized, and he wasted no time in setting his priorities. "Let's start with a full review of employee conduct," James said, his tone decisive. "I want records of customer complaints, employee evaluations, and internal investigations. We need to understand what we're dealing with." His assistant, Grace, nodded, already taking notes. "I'll have the HR department compile the reports immediately," she said. Within hours, the preliminary findings began to trickle in. What James discovered confirmed his suspicions. The airline had a troubling history of discriminatory behavior among its staff. Complaints ranged from microaggressions to outright hostility, and many of them had been dismissed without proper follow-up. One name appeared repeatedly in the reports: Claire Roberts. James's stomach churned as he read through the details. There were accounts of passengers of color being ignored, elderly travelers left to struggle on their own, and even complaints from fellow employees about Claire's unprofessional conduct. One complaint stood out in particular. A young mother traveling with her biracial child had written about how Claire's dismissive behavior left her humiliated. "My daughter asked me why the lady didn't like us," the mother had written. "How do you explain that to a 5-year-old? The words struck a chord with James. Memories of his own childhood resurfaced, moments when he had been treated unfairly because of how he looked or where he came from. He had hoped that progress had been made, but the evidence before him painted a different picture. "This isn't just about Claire," James muttered to himself. "This is systemic." He called a meeting with his executive team to discuss the findings. "We're not here to place blame on one individual," he began. "What we're dealing with is a cultural issue that has been allowed to fester for too long. Fixing this will require a complete overhaul of how we operate." The team agreed, and plans for immediate action were set in motion. James proposed mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, a transparent complaint resolution process, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. "Change starts with education," James said, "but it doesn't end there. We need to hold ourselves accountable from the top down." As part of the new initiative, Claire was informed that she would be required to attend a cultural sensitivity training session. The notification was delivered in a sealed envelope, which Claire opened during her shift in the staff lounge. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. "Mandatory sensitivity training?" she muttered under her breath, crumpling the notice in her hand. "This has to be a joke." Claire's frustration only grew as the day went on. During a break, she vented to her colleague Lisa, a fellow flight attendant and one of the few people she trusted. "Can you believe this?" Claire fumed, waving the crumpled notice. "They're acting like I don't know how to do my job." Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe it's not a bad thing," she said hesitantly. "We could all use a little refresher sometimes." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying I'm insensitive?" No, Lisa backpedaled quickly. "I just mean, things are changing. Maybe the company wants us to be better prepared for certain situations." Claire scoffed, standing abruptly. "I don't need this. I've been doing this job for over a decade, and I've always done it well. This is a waste of time." She stormed out of the lounge, her thoughts racing. Though she was adamant about her abilities, a small part of her couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. Claire Roberts arrived at the training center the following Monday, her frustration palpable. The glass doors reflected her stern expression as she entered the lobby, where a few other employees were already gathered, signing in for the session. The chatter of her colleagues felt distant as Claire clutched the crumpled notice in her hand. "What a waste of time," she muttered to herself, scrawling her name on the sign-in sheet. She made her way into the training room, deliberately choosing a seat near the back. Folding her arms tightly across her chest, Claire slouched in her chair, projecting an air of indifference. The trainer, a cheerful woman named Nina Patel, began the session with an infectious energy. "Good morning, everyone," she greeted, her warm smile filling the room. "Today we'll be discussing cultural sensitivity and how it impacts our interactions with passengers and colleagues alike." Claire barely looked up, her attention drifting between the clock on the wall and the phone she had discreetly placed under the table. Her irritation deepened as Nina launched into the session, using examples and anecdotes to illustrate the importance of empathy and understanding in a diverse workplace. Would anyone like to share an example of a time they felt misunderstood or excluded? Nina asked, her tone inviting. The room was silent for a moment before a young flight attendant raised her hand. "There was a time when a passenger assumed I couldn't speak English because of my accent," she said hesitantly. "It was humiliating." Nina nodded empathetically. "Thank you for sharing." Situations like these remind us why cultural awareness is so important. Claire rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. "Here we go." "Claire," Nina said, her voice gentle but firm. "Would you like to share your thoughts?" Caught off guard, Claire straightened in her chair, her expression guarded. "I don't really have anything to add," she replied flatly. "I've always done my job just fine." Nina's smile didn't falter. "That's fair," she said diplomatically. "But even the best of us can always learn something new. Growth is a continuous process." The rest of the session progressed with role-playing exercises and group discussions, but Claire's participation was minimal. When asked how she would assist a non-English-speaking passenger, her response was dismissive. "I'd just speak louder and slower," she said with a shrug. Nina gently suggested alternative approaches, but Claire waved her off. "We can't cater to everyone's needs. Sometimes people need to adapt to our way of doing things." A tense silence settled over the room. Some of Claire's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nina took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "Thank you for your honesty, Claire," she said. "It's important to acknowledge different perspectives, even when they challenge us." The session concluded with each participant being asked to share one takeaway. When it was Claire's turn, she leaned back in her chair, her tone heavy with sarcasm. "I guess I learned that we're supposed to walk on eggshells now. Wouldn't want to offend anyone while doing our jobs." Nina's expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "Thank you for your input," she said. "I hope as you reflect, you'll find meaningful lessons to apply." Unbeknownst to Claire, a discreet camera in the back of the room had been recording the entire session. Every instance of her disengagement and resistance was captured, and the footage would soon make its way to James Carter's desk. Back at the airline's headquarters, James reviewed the training reports with a mix of frustration and determination. He had been monitoring Claire's progress closely, not to single her out, but to understand how deeply the company's issues ran. "How's she doing?" Grace, his assistant, asked as she placed a steaming cup of coffee on his desk. James sighed, clicking through the training footage. "It's hard to tell," he admitted. "There are moments where she seems to understand, but most of the time, it's like she's resisting, fighting herself." He paused the video on a frame of Claire slouched in her chair, her arms crossed. "Her old habits are deeply ingrained," he said, "but she's trying, in her own way." Grace hesitated before speaking. "What's the next step?" James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "She needs to confront the impact of her behavior head-on. It's not enough to sit through a training session. She has to see the consequences of her actions." With that, James began drafting a new initiative. Claire would be required to participate in a live-streamed session, sharing her experiences and reflections with colleagues across the company. It was a bold move, but James believed it was necessary to break through the walls she had built around herself. The notification landed in Claire's inbox like a thunderclap. She read it twice, her hands trembling slightly. "As part of the company's initiative for transparency and growth, your next session will be broadcast live," the email stated. Panic set in. Claire's mind raced as she imagined standing in front of a camera, her every word scrutinized by colleagues, supervisors, and even senior executives. She would have to revisit the day she confronted James, a moment that now haunted her. That night, Claire sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by crumpled drafts of her speech. Everything she wrote felt hollow, like excuses. "I can't do this," she whispered, burying her face in her hands. But running wasn't an option anymore. This was her chance, not just to salvage her reputation, but to prove to herself that she could change. Slowly, she picked up her pen again, this time writing from a place of truth. She acknowledged her prejudices, her assumptions, and the harm she had caused. She wrote about the shame and discomfort of facing her flaws and her determination to do better. The morning of the live stream, Claire dressed meticulously in her uniform, smoothing every wrinkle. As she arrived at the training center, the sight of technicians setting up equipment sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. "Ready when you are," a young staffer said, offering an encouraging smile. Claire nodded stiffly, taking her place in front of the camera. The red light blinked on, signaling the start of the broadcast. She clasped her trembling hands together and began. "Hello, everyone," she said, her voice faltering. "My name is Claire Roberts, and I'm here to talk about a mistake I made." Emotion filled her voice as she recounted her actions and the painful journey that followed. For the first time, she truly understood the gravity of her behavior and the impact it had on others. As the live stream continued, Claire felt the weight of her words lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose. She was no longer hiding. She was taking the first step toward real change. Claire Roberts' voice trembled as she recounted the moment that had changed everything. The confrontation with James Carter in the first-class cabin. Sitting before the camera, with colleagues from across the company watching the live stream, she felt exposed. Her words were raw and unfiltered. "I treated a passenger unfairly because of my assumptions. I let my biases dictate my actions, and in doing so, I failed to uphold the values this airline claims to represent. For that, I am deeply sorry." The room behind the camera was silent, save for the soft hum of the equipment. Claire felt her chest tighten as she forced herself to continue. "It's easy to point fingers or make excuses, but the truth is, I have no one to blame but myself. That day I made a mistake, not just as a flight attendant, but as a person." As she spoke, Claire's mind replayed the incident in vivid detail. She remembered the sharp crack of her hand against James's cheek, the collective gasp of the passengers, and the cold realization that followed. At the time, she had clung to her indignation, unwilling to admit she was wrong. Now, standing at this crossroads, there was no room for denial. "I grew up in a small town where everyone looked like me and thought like me," Claire admitted, her voice soft. "Diversity wasn't something we talked about. It wasn't something we even noticed. When I became a flight attendant, I carried those blind spots with me. I didn't see it then, but looking back, I realize how much harm I caused by holding on to those biases. Her eyes scanned the audience behind the camera, imagining the faces of her colleagues. Some were likely skeptical, others perhaps sympathetic. But Claire knew that trust wouldn't come easily. She had to earn it. I'm not proud of who I was, she continued, her voice steadying. But I am committed to becoming better. Not just for myself, but for the passengers who rely on us to make them feel safe and valued, and for the colleagues who deserve to work in an environment built on respect and inclusivity. When Claire finished, there was a long pause. Then scattered applause began to build, hesitant but genuine. She knew it wasn't forgiveness, she wasn't asking for that. It was, however, a beginning. After the broadcast, Claire sat in a small conference room, her hands trembling as she sipped from a cup of lukewarm tea. The weight of her confession still lingered, but there was also a strange sense of relief. A knock at the door startled her. When she looked up, James Carter stood in the doorway. "May I come in?" he asked, his tone neutral. Claire's heart sank. She had been expecting this moment, but wasn't sure she was ready for it. "Of course," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James entered, closing the door behind him. He took a seat across from her, studying her carefully. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Claire felt as though the room itself held its breath. Finally, James spoke. "Do you remember the passenger you had an altercation with that day?" Claire's face turned pale. "Yes," she whispered, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "I remember. That passenger was me," James said evenly. The words hit Claire like a bolt of lightning. Her breath caught in her throat, and her eyes widened in shock. "I didn't know," she stammered. James nodded. "I suspected as much. That day, I was furious, not just because of how you treated me, but because of what your actions represented. It wasn't just about one person being rude to another. It was a symptom of something much larger." Claire's eyes brimmed with tears. "I don't know what to say," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't undo what I did, but I truly am." James' expression remained calm, though his tone carried a hint of firmness. "Claire, I could have fired you. I had every right to. But I realized that simply letting you go wouldn't fix the problem. It would have been easy, but it wouldn't have changed anything." Claire nodded, her throat tight. "Why didn't you?" "Because I believe in second chances," James replied. "I've had my fair share of them, and I know how transformative they can be. But this isn't just about you or me. It's about setting a standard for the entire company." Claire wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. "Thank you. I don't deserve this, but I promise I won't waste it." James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "This isn't a reward, Claire. It's an opportunity. You've taken the first step, but real change requires ongoing effort. Are you ready for that?" "Yes," Claire said, her voice resolute. "I'm ready." In the days that followed, Claire began a new chapter in her career. James offered her a position within the airline's cultural transformation team, a role that would require her to share her story, lead workshops, and help develop initiatives to foster inclusivity. When James introduced Claire to the team, the reception was mixed. Some colleagues welcomed her with open minds, while others regarded her with skepticism. Claire couldn't blame them. She knew her past actions would cast a long shadow. "I know many of you have doubts about me," Claire said during her first meeting with the team. "I don't expect your trust right away, but I promise to earn it. I'm here to learn, to grow, and to help others do the same." Her words were met with cautious nods and murmurs of agreement. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the weeks went on, Claire threw herself into her work. She collaborated with the team to design comprehensive training programs, drawing from her own experiences to make the lessons impactful. She spent hours researching best practices, attending workshops, and speaking with colleagues to understand their perspectives. Though progress was slow, Claire began to see the fruits of her labor. Her workshops received positive feedback, and employees who had once avoided her began to warm up to her. Even passengers noticed the shift in the airline's culture, reporting a newfound sense of respect and inclusivity. One afternoon, as Claire prepared for a meeting, a colleague named Marcus approached her. He had been one of her harshest critics, often questioning her sincerity. "Claire," Marcus said, his tone hesitant, "I wanted to say, I was wrong about you. Your dedication, it's made a difference. Claire smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt a sense of hope. She knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but she was determined to continue walking it, not just for herself, but for the countless others her actions had affected. Claire Roberts' transformation was far from easy. Though she had embraced her new role in the cultural transformation team, each day brought new challenges. She found herself constantly under scrutiny, not only from her colleagues, but from within. She questioned her past choices, revisited old habits, and wondered how she could truly make amends for the harm she had caused. The company's culture, however, was beginning to shift, and Claire was becoming a part of that change. James Carter's initiatives were rolling out across the organization: mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, transparent reporting channels, and diversity workshops tailored to address systemic issues within the airline. One of Claire's primary responsibilities was facilitating workshops designed to help employees confront unconscious biases. These sessions were highly interactive, requiring participants to engage in role-playing exercises, group discussions, and case studies. Initially, Claire faced resistance. Some employees dismissed the training as unnecessary or viewed it as a corporate box-ticking exercise. Claire couldn't blame them. After all, she had once shared the same skepticism. But as the sessions progressed, a surprising thing happened. The stories shared during these workshops began to resonate, breaking through the barriers of indifference. In one session, Claire shared her own experience with prejudice. She recounted how she had grown up in a small, homogeneous town where biases were rarely questioned. "I didn't even realize I had them," she admitted, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It wasn't until I saw the harm I'd caused and had to face it head-on that I understood the impact of my actions." Her vulnerability struck a chord with the participants. Slowly, they began to open up, sharing their own experiences and acknowledging the biases they had carried. Despite the progress, Claire couldn't escape the shadows of her past. Some colleagues remained skeptical, and their trust was hard to earn. Marcus, a senior team member, had been especially vocal in questioning her commitment. During a team meeting, Marcus addressed Claire directly. "How do we know this isn't just for show?" he asked, his tone sharp. "It's easy to say the right things in front of a camera or in a workshop, but how do we know you've really changed?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Claire, waiting to see how she would respond. She felt her cheeks grow hot, but instead of shrinking back, she met Marcus's gaze. "That's a fair question," she said, her voice calm. "And honestly, I don't expect you to take my word for it. Trust takes time, and I know I have to earn it. But what I can promise you is that I'm here for the long haul. I'm not doing this to check a box or fix my reputation. I'm doing this because I want to be better for myself, my colleagues, and the passengers we serve." Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding slightly. "Fair enough," he said, his tone less accusatory. After the meeting, Claire approached Marcus privately. "Thank you for challenging me," she said. "It's important to hold each other accountable, and I appreciate you being honest." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said with a faint smile. Outside of her work, Claire found herself reflecting on the incident with James more often than she liked. She couldn't shake the image of his calm demeanor as she lashed out at him, or the way he had chosen to respond with grace instead of anger. One evening, as she prepared for another workshop, Claire received an email from James. The subject line was simple: "Your journey matters." In the email, James wrote about his own experiences with prejudice, both as a young man and as a leader in the corporate world. "Growth isn't linear," he wrote. "It's messy, uncomfortable, and often painful. But it's also transformative. You've taken the hardest step, acknowledging your mistakes. Now, you have the opportunity to create lasting change, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you." Claire read the email twice, then a third time. His words were a balm to her insecurities, reminding her that while her past couldn't be erased, her future was still unwritten. Weeks turned into months, and the impact of James's initiatives became increasingly evident. Employee feedback reflected a newfound sense of inclusion, and passengers began to notice the difference in the way they were treated. Complaints of discriminatory behavior had dropped significantly, replaced by compliments praising the airline's improved service. Claire's own workshops became a cornerstone of the transformation. She designed activities that encouraged employees to step into each other's shoes, fostering empathy and understanding. In one memorable session, she introduced an exercise called A Day in Their Life, where participants were assigned roles that required them to navigate hypothetical challenges based on race, age, or physical ability. The results were eye-opening. Employees who had previously dismissed the concept of bias found themselves grappling with feelings of frustration and helplessness. "I never realized how exhausting it could be," one participant admitted. "It's like you're constantly trying to prove you belong." Claire nodded, her voice firm but compassionate. "That's exactly why these conversations matter. We can't change what we don't understand." As Claire's credibility grew, so did her confidence. One afternoon, she was approached by a young flight attendant named Maria, who had recently joined the airline. "Claire," Maria began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story in the workshops. It made me feel like I wasn't alone." Claire smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "That means a lot, Maria. If there's ever anything you want to talk about, my door is always open." Maria nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's inspiring to see how much you've changed. It gives me hope that things can get better." For the first time in a long time, Claire felt a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't just making amends, she was helping to build something better. One day, James called a meeting to reflect on the company's progress. Standing before a room filled with employees, he spoke with pride. "The changes we've implemented aren't just benefiting our passengers. They're making this a place where everyone feels valued," he said. "But these changes wouldn't have been possible without leaders who show us the power of growth and accountability." James scanned the room, his gaze landing on Claire. "Claire, would you stand for a moment?" Claire rose slowly, her face flushed with emotion as the room erupted into applause. She saw admiration in the eyes of her colleagues, an acknowledgement of how far she had come. For Claire, it wasn't just validation. It was a reminder that change, while difficult, was always worth pursuing. As Claire Roberts sat in her small office, reviewing notes for an upcoming workshop, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The applause she had received during the company meeting had been gratifying, but it also came with a renewed sense of responsibility. Her colleagues were beginning to trust her, but Claire knew she still had a long way to go to prove she was worthy of their respect. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Come in," she called, looking up. It was Marcus, the colleague who had once been her harshest critic. He stepped inside, holding a folder and wearing a cautious expression. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Of course," Claire said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. "Bookmark, go back." Marcus sat down, placing the folder on the desk between them. "I wanted to show you something," he began, sliding it toward her. Claire opened the folder to find a series of feedback forms from one of her recent workshops. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, with participants praising her ability to facilitate meaningful discussions and create a safe space for vulnerability. "This is good," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "Really good. People are noticing the difference you're making." Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. Marcus hesitated before continuing. "I'll admit I wasn't sure about you at first, but I've been watching, and I can see you're serious about this. I respect that." Claire met his gaze, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "That means a lot, Marcus. Truly." He nodded, standing to leave. "Keep it up," he said before walking out. That evening, as Claire packed up her things to head home, she received a call from James Carter. "Claire," James said, his voice calm and steady. "I need your help with something." "Of course," Claire replied immediately. "What's going on?" "I'm organizing a series of listening sessions with passengers who've had negative experiences with our airline," James explained. "I think it's important for us to hear directly from them about what needs to change." Claire felt a pang of anxiety at the thought. "You want me to be part of these sessions?" "Yes," James said. "You've been through this journey yourself. I think your perspective could be incredibly valuable. Claire hesitated but ultimately agreed. I'll do it, she said. The first listening session was held in a modest conference room at one of the airline's hub airports. A diverse group of passengers had been invited to share their stories, ranging from minor inconveniences to deeply personal accounts of discrimination. Claire sat alongside James and a few other members of the cultural transformation team. She listened intently as one passenger after another recounted their experiences. A young black man spoke about being asked repeatedly to prove his ticket was valid, despite sitting in the correct seat. It felt like they were looking for a reason to say I didn't belong, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. An elderly Asian woman shared a story about being ignored by a flight attendant when she asked for assistance. I felt invisible, she said, her hands trembling. Like I didn't matter. Each story hit Claire like a blow to the chest. She recognized echoes of her own behavior in their accounts, and the weight of her past actions felt heavier than ever. When the session ended, James addressed the group. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. We can't undo the harm that's been done, but we are committed to making things right. Your voices are critical to that process. As the passengers began to leave, Claire approached the elderly Asian woman. Ma'am, she said gently, thank you for sharing your story. I want you to know that we're working hard to ensure no one ever feels the way you did. The woman looked at Claire with kind but weary eyes. It's a long road, she said softly. Claire nodded. It is, but we'll walk it. The listening sessions became a turning point for Claire. They deepened her understanding of the impact of bias and strengthened her resolve to create meaningful change. Back at the office, she began collaborating with the team on new initiatives based on the feedback from the sessions. One idea was the development of an anonymous passenger feedback system that would allow travelers to rate their experiences and report concerns without fear of being dismissed. We need transparency, Claire said during a team meeting. If passengers feel like their voices are being heard, it'll go a long way toward rebuilding trust. The team agreed, and the feedback system was quickly implemented. Within weeks, they began receiving valuable insights that helped identify areas for improvement. As Claire continued her work, she found herself becoming a mentor to newer employees. Maria, the young flight attendant who had once thanked Claire for her workshops, frequently sought her advice. One afternoon, Maria approached Claire with a concerned expression. I had a passenger today who seemed upset, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong, she said. I tried asking if they needed anything, but they just said, it's fine. Claire nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes it's not about what they say, it's about what they're feeling. Try to notice the little things, body language, tone of voice. Even if they don't say it directly, they're often telling you what they need. Maria smiled, her shoulders relaxing. Thanks, Claire. I'll keep that in mind. Though progress was being made, Claire knew there was still work to be done. She often reminded herself of James's words. Growth isn't linear. It's messy, uncomfortable, and often painful. One morning, as she prepared for a leadership meeting, Claire received an email from a passenger who had attended one of the listening sessions. The subject line read, "Thank you." In the email, the passenger wrote, I wasn't sure anything would come of those sessions, but I can see the difference. It's clear the airline is trying to change, and I appreciate that. It gives me hope. Claire read the email twice, her heart swelling with gratitude. It was a small victory, but it reminded her why she had chosen to take this path. As she headed into the meeting, Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, she truly believed that lasting change was possible. Claire Roberts stood in the bustling staff lounge, her heart pounding as she prepared for her next big challenge, addressing her past actions directly. James Carter had organized a company-wide event where she would share her journey and engage in a candid discussion with passengers and colleagues. The event, broadcast live to employees across the airline, was meant to symbolize the company's commitment to accountability and growth. As the event approached, Claire felt a mix of dread and determination. The memories of her confrontation with James replayed in her mind, sharp and vivid. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about demonstrating that change was possible, even for someone who had been part of the problem. The event took place in a large conference room at the airline's headquarters, with rows of chairs set up for employees and guests. Cameras were positioned strategically, capturing every angle for the live stream. James stood at the podium, addressing the audience with his usual calm authority. "Today is an important moment for our company," he began. "We're here not just to reflect on where we've been, but to chart a path forward, one built on trust, respect, and accountability." He turned to Claire, who was seated nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Claire Roberts has agreed to share her story with us today. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's a necessary step in our journey toward meaningful change." The room fell silent as Claire approached the podium. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the stand. "My name is Claire Roberts," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. "And I need to be honest with all of you. I made serious mistakes that hurt people. I let my biases and assumptions dictate my actions, and for that, I am deeply sorry." She paused, scanning the room. Faces of colleagues, passengers, and executives stared back at her, some curious, others skeptical. The weight of their gaze was heavy, but Claire pressed on. "A few months ago, I treated a passenger unfairly because I assumed he didn't belong in first class. I didn't ask questions or try to understand, I just assumed. And when he stood his ground, I reacted in a way that was completely unacceptable." Claire's voice cracked as she continued. "That passenger was James Carter. At the time, I didn't know who he was, but it shouldn't have mattered. No one deserves to be treated the way I treated him." The room was so quiet that Claire could hear the faint hum of the cameras recording her every word. "Since that day," she said, "I've been on a journey of self-reflection and growth. It hasn't been easy, and I've had to face some uncomfortable truths about myself. But I've also learned that it's never too late to change." She glanced toward James, her voice softening. "I want to thank you, James, for giving me the chance to make things right. You didn't have to, but you believed in my ability to grow, and I'll always be grateful for that." As Claire stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't universal. Some clapped hesitantly, others with genuine enthusiasm, but it was a start. The next segment of the event was a panel discussion, where Claire and James sat alongside other employees and passengers who had been part of the airline's transformation efforts. The moderator, a senior communications officer, guided the conversation with thoughtful questions. "Claire," the moderator began, "what was the turning point for you in this journey?" Claire thought for a moment before responding. "The turning point was when I realized the impact of my actions, not just on the person I mistreated, but on everyone who witnessed it. I saw the ripple effect of that moment, and it made me realize how much power we have as employees to shape someone's experience, for better or worse." Another panelist, Maria, spoke up. "I've learned so much from working with Claire," she said. "Her vulnerability and honesty have inspired me to be more self-aware in my own work." Claire smiled at Maria, feeling a surge of gratitude for the support she had received from her colleagues. As the event drew to a close, James addressed the audience once more. "This isn't the end of our journey," he said. "It's just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do, but I'm confident that with people like Claire leading the way, we can create a culture where everyone feels valued and respected." After the event, Claire lingered in the conference room, absorbing the experience. She felt both exhausted and invigorated, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. James approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You did well today," he said. "Thank you," Claire replied. "It wasn't easy, but I'm glad I did it." James nodded. "Growth rarely is. But you've shown that you're willing to do the work, and that's what matters." As they spoke, a passenger who had attended the event approached them. It was the elderly Asian woman from the listening session. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said to Claire. "Your honesty today means a lot. It gives me hope that things can get better." Claire felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means everything to me." The impact of the event was immediate. Employees across the airline began sharing their own stories of growth and reflection, inspired by Claire's courage. Passengers who had once felt alienated by the airline's culture began to notice the changes taking root. For Claire, the event marked a turning point in her journey. She knew there was still work to be done, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The support of her colleagues and the trust of the passengers they served fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. As she left the conference room that evening, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she believed she was truly on the right path. The days following the company-wide event were a whirlwind for Claire Roberts. Messages poured in from colleagues across the airline, some congratulating her on her courage, others sharing their own struggles and growth. Each message reminded Claire of the ripple effect her journey was having on the company. Despite the encouraging responses, Claire knew the real work was only beginning. She threw herself into her role on the cultural transformation team, collaborating on initiatives that would ensure the changes taking root in the company were lasting. One of the team's most ambitious projects was the development of an immersive training program. Dubbed Bridges Beyond Bias, the program aimed to tackle unconscious prejudice by fostering empathy and understanding. Participants would engage in scenarios simulating the challenges faced by passengers and colleagues from diverse backgrounds. During a brainstorming session, Claire suggested an idea that stemmed from her own experiences. "What if we incorporate real stories into the program?" she proposed. Hearing first-hand accounts of discrimination and resilience could make the training more impactful. The team embraced the idea, and Claire took the lead in gathering stories from passengers and employees. She interviewed dozens of individuals, listening to accounts that ranged from heartbreaking to hopeful. Each story deepened her understanding of the challenges people faced and strengthened her resolve to be part of the solution. One story, in particular, stayed with Claire. It came from an older flight attendant named Donna, who had worked for the airline for over 25 years. "I've seen so much change in this industry," Donna told Claire during their interview. "But one thing that stayed the same is the way some people get treated differently just because of how they look. It's subtle sometimes, little things like who gets served first or who gets ignored. But it adds up." Donna's voice grew softer as she continued. "I've tried to stand up for people when I see it happen, but there have been times when I stayed quiet because I was afraid of causing trouble. I regret those moments the most." Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She had been the cause of those moments for others, and now she was speaking to someone who had borne witness to them. "Thank you for sharing this with me," Claire said earnestly. "It takes courage to be honest about these things." Donna nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It takes courage to change, too. And I can see you're doing that, Claire. Keep going." As the Bridges Beyond Bias program began to take shape, Claire faced another challenge, earning the trust of passengers who had been affected by the airline's past failings. James Carter had encouraged her to take on a more visible role in passenger engagement efforts, believing her story could help rebuild the airline's reputation. At first, Claire was hesitant. She worried that passengers would see her as a symbol of the company's past mistakes, rather than its efforts to improve. But James reminded her of the importance of vulnerability in fostering trust. "People don't expect perfection," James told her during a one-on-one meeting. "They expect honesty. Show them who you are now, and they'll see the difference." Claire's first major test came during a passenger forum held at the airline's headquarters. The event was open to the public, and dozens of travelers attended to voice their concerns and suggestions. As Claire took the stage to address the audience, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. But she reminded herself of James' words and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "I know some of you may have had negative experiences with our airline in the past, and for that, I want to start by saying I'm sorry. I was part of the problem, and I take full responsibility for my actions." The room was silent, the audience hanging on her every word. "But I also want you to know that I'm committed to being part of the solution," Claire continued. "Our airline is working hard to create a culture where every passenger feels valued and respected. It's a journey, and we still have a long way to go, but I promise you, we're making progress." Claire then opened the floor to questions and feedback. Some passengers were skeptical, their questions pointed and direct. Others were cautiously optimistic, sharing suggestions for improvement. Claire answered each question honestly, acknowledging the company's shortcomings while emphasizing the steps being taken to address them. By the end of the forum, the atmosphere had shifted. Passengers who had entered the room with folded arms and guarded expressions began to soften. Some even approached Claire afterward to thank her for her honesty and commitment. One passenger, a middle-aged black woman named Evelyn, lingered after the event to speak with Claire privately. "I watched your speech during the company event," Evelyn said. "It couldn't have been easy to stand up there and admit your mistakes." Claire nodded, her voice quiet. "It wasn't. But it was necessary." Evelyn studied her for a moment before smiling. "It takes courage to do what you're doing. I've had my fair share of bad experiences with airlines, but seeing someone like you take accountability gives me hope that things can change." Claire felt a swell of emotion as she shook Evelyn's hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Back at the office, Claire shared the results of the passenger forum with her team. The feedback they had gathered provided valuable insights into what passengers valued most: consistent service, genuine care, and a commitment to treating everyone with dignity. "We've got a lot of work to do," Claire told the team during a meeting. "But if we stay focused on these priorities, we can make a real difference." Her colleagues nodded in agreement, and the room buzzed with renewed energy. As the airline continued to evolve, Claire found herself growing in ways she hadn't anticipated. She became a mentor, a leader, and perhaps most importantly, a listener. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been transformative. Not just for her, but for the countless passengers and employees who were beginning to feel the impact of the changes she had helped implement. One afternoon, as Claire prepared for another workshop, she received an email from James. The subject line read, "The next step." In the email, James wrote, "Your efforts have been instrumental in getting us this far, but we're not done yet. I'd like to discuss how we can expand our initiatives to reach even more people. Let's meet next week to brainstorm." Claire smiled as she read the message. The work ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she felt ready to embrace it fully. Claire Roberts stepped into James Carter's office the following week, carrying a folder filled with ideas for expanding the airline's diversity and inclusion initiatives. She had spent days refining her proposals, driven by a determination to build on the progress they had made. James greeted her with a warm smile, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I've been looking forward to this," he said, his tone encouraging. "So have I," Claire replied, placing the folder on the desk. "I've outlined a few ways we can deepen our impact, not just within the airline but across the industry." As James reviewed her proposals, Claire spoke passionately about her vision. "I think it's time we establish a mentorship program," she said. "Experienced employees can guide new hires, sharing not just skills but values that align with the culture we're building. It'll help reinforce what we're trying to achieve." James nodded thoughtfully. "I like it. Mentorship can be a powerful tool for change." And Claire continued, "I think we should partner with organizations that specialize in community outreach. We can offer scholarships, sponsor educational programs, and create opportunities for underrepresented groups to pursue careers in aviation." James leaned back in his chair, a look of pride crossing his face. "Claire, this is exactly the kind of forward thinking we need. Let's make it happen." In the months that followed, Claire's proposals came to life. The mentorship program was launched with great success, pairing seasoned employees with newcomers eager to learn and grow. The program not only strengthened bonds within the company, but also created a ripple effect of positive change throughout the workforce. The airline's partnership with community organizations also garnered widespread praise. Through scholarships and outreach initiatives, the company began to attract a more diverse pool of talent, signaling its commitment to inclusivity. Claire played an active role in these efforts, often visiting schools and community centers to speak about her journey and the opportunities available in aviation. Her honesty and vulnerability resonated with audiences, inspiring many to pursue dreams they had once considered out of reach. As the airline's culture continued to evolve, so did Claire. She no longer felt defined by her past mistakes, but rather empowered by the lessons she had learned. Her story became a symbol of the company's transformation, a testament to the power of accountability, growth, and second chances. During one particularly memorable event, Claire was invited to speak at a national conference on diversity in the workplace. Standing before a packed audience of industry leaders, she shared her journey with candor and conviction. "I'm not here today because I did everything right," she began. "I'm here because I made mistakes and I learned from them. I learned that change isn't about perfection, it's about progress, about taking small steps every day to be better than we were yesterday." Her words were met with a standing ovation, the applause echoing long after she left the stage. Back at the airline's headquarters, James called a meeting with the cultural transformation team to reflect on their progress. "The work we've done over the past year has been remarkable," he said, addressing the room. "We've seen complaints of discrimination decrease significantly. Employee satisfaction is at an all-time high and passengers are noticing the difference. But let's not forget, this is a journey, not a destination." He turned to Claire, his expression warm. "Claire, your leadership has been a driving force behind these changes. Would you like to say a few words?" Claire stood, her heart pounding as she looked around the room at her colleagues. Many of them had doubted her at the start, but now their faces were filled with respect and admiration. "I just want to say thank you," she began. "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove that change is possible. This journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth every step. And I want you all to know that I'm not done learning. I'm not done growing. None of us are." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Claire felt a sense of closure. As the airline moved forward, the initiatives Claire had helped implement became a blueprint for other companies in the industry. Articles were written about the airline's transformation, and Claire's story was often highlighted as an example of what true accountability and growth could achieve. One afternoon, while reviewing feedback from the latest round of training sessions, Claire received a surprise visitor. Evelyn, the middle-aged passenger she had met after the company-wide event. "Evelyn," Claire said, rising to greet her. "What brings you here?" "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by," Evelyn said with a smile. "I wanted to see how things were going." Claire gestured for Evelyn to sit, and they spent the next hour catching up. Evelyn shared stories about her own experiences with other airlines, noting how different her recent flights with Claire's company had been. "You've really made a difference," Evelyn said. "It's not just the policies, it's the people. You can feel the change in the way they treat you." Claire felt a lump in her throat. "That means everything to me," she said softly. Evelyn reached across the table, placing a hand on Claire's. "Keep going," she said. "The world needs more people like you." As the sun set over the city that evening, Claire stood by her office window, gazing out at the bustling airport. Planes taxied on the runway, their lights twinkling against the twilight sky. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt at peace, not because her journey was over, but because she had found her purpose. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and struggle. But she also knew she had the strength to face them. Her phone buzzed with a notification, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from James. "Great work today. Let's keep building." Claire smiled as she typed a reply. "Absolutely. Let's keep building." With that, she gathered her things and left her office, ready to face whatever came next. The airline's transformation became a beacon of hope within the industry, inspiring other companies to follow suit. Claire's journey from a flight attendant burdened by bias to a leader championing inclusivity served as a powerful reminder of what was possible when individuals and organizations committed to change. And for Claire, the greatest lesson of all was this. Growth wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, using those lessons to create a brighter, more equitable future for everyone. The journey of Claire Roberts and James Carter is more than just a story about redemption. It's a powerful reminder of the transformative impact of accountability, empathy, and the willingness to change. Claire's path from a flight attendant burdened by her biases to a leader fostering inclusivity is proof that no matter how deeply ingrained our flaws may be, growth is always possible when we commit to self-reflection and action. James's decision to approach prejudice with patience and purpose, rather than anger, set the stage for lasting transformation. Not just for Claire, but for an entire organization. His belief in second chances and his determination to address systemic issues head-on turned a moment of personal affront into an opportunity to create a culture of respect and equality. This story reminds us that progress isn't about perfection. It's about small, consistent steps toward understanding and treating one another with dignity. In a world where division often seems to dominate, stories like this highlight the incredible power of humility and perseverance to bring people together and inspire change. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you find it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't stop there. Share your own stories of growth, change, or moments that inspired you in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Let's continue the conversation and make waves of positivity together. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep building a kinder, more understanding world. Thank you for being a part of this journey.